It's pretty much getting to the time of year where I want to be sleeping out here. The weather's warming up quite nicely. It's not getting below zero anymore, so I want to be out here and spending the night. But the issue with that right now, just for my own personal comfort, is sort of that I have a big hole right in this area. So today, the plan for me will be to build a door. I don't want to go too crazy with this. I want something to essentially cover the space, but I also want something that's going to be, not just trash. So the plan is to spend somewhere between 2 hours and 2 weeks building this door, and we'll see what we get. So I brought out all my tools today. I borrowed a saw from my brother since my last saw broke on me, which it's a great saw. It's just not all in one piece anymore, which is kind of problematic. So I've got a saw today that I'll be using. I've got a drill that I'll be using. I've got a chisel that'll be really handy. And all that stuff should be enough for me to make a door. I'm actually trained in cabinet making. It's something that I went to college for. Mind you, this is a little bit different from that fine carpentry that I was trained in, but we'll see if any of that's really applicable here. Shoot, I just realized I forgot to get a measuring tape. I guess I'm gonna have to find something to do that. Well, we'll make do with what we got, so we'll see what happens.
So the first step for me will be to make door jambs to fill the space. This will help by getting me a nice squared off area that I can put the door in. So for this process, I'm using an old ash tree that I felled a little while ago, and I actually used this ash tree for most of the wood for this job. Ash is a good strong wood and generally it splits pretty well. Also, ash tree is kind of dwindling in my area. We recently had an ash borer come through. It's killed most of the ash trees. So this is a tree that was already dying, if not dead, when I cut it down. So it was a good use of the wood. So the next part of this process to get these ash logs down to workable pieces of wood was I was going to have to split them. Unfortunately, this piece of ash did not split as well as I would have liked, but at least it split, so that was something. And once it was split and roughly squared to shape, then I could use it for door jambs. Part of this process of splitting it, because it didn't split perfectly, did involve chopping it down and carving it down with my axe quite a bit. Sometimes splits don't go as well as you would like, and you have to make do. And for a lot of this process, I was just chopping it down to try and get it nice and square. I mean, you'll always have a little bit of chopping to do to get it square, but sometimes it's more than others. After I had the piece of wood squared for the door jamb, I held it up and marked it out on the piece of wood that I was going to be putting it into. I played around with a few different ideas of how I was going to do this. I decided upon putting a groove in the log that was above the door jambs, and that I was just going to put the door jamb into there, and that'd be a way that I could have it fixed all in one point, so it wasn't going to be shaking around. After I had the marked out area cut with a saw, I took my chisel and a piece of scrap wood that was sitting around, and I was able to just chisel out the area between so I could get myself a nice deep groove to put in the door jamb. After I had the door jamb roughly secured at the top, I wanted to have some way that it could be secured at the bottom as well. So I took my drill and I started drilling a hole through the base of the door jamb, and I was planning on going straight into the log so that I could run a dowel through the jamb into the log. Unfortunately, this process didn't go quite as smoothly as I'd hoped for. I ended up getting that drill bit stuck in that door jamb. I managed to get it out eventually, but when you're using a hand drill, it's always best to make sure that you're using the right kind of drill bit. In this case, I wasn't. It cut nicely, but it did get stuck. After I got the drill bit out of the jamb, I carved down a dowel out of a scrap piece of ash, and I was finally able to secure it at the top and the bottom. Unfortunately, my camera ran out of memory at that point, and that happened more than once that I thought I was filming something that I wasn't. After I finished that jamb, I just did the same thing for the other side. Split the log, carve it down, carve a little dowel, drill the hole, this time with an appropriately sized drill bit, and then put it right into the wall. I was pretty happy at this point. I was a couple hours in, and I was finally starting to see some door frame shape take hold. It's worth mentioning this whole process of the door jambs and the door itself and all the collecting of materials I was able to do in the woods in probably about 8 hours, give or take a few. After I had the sides of the frame secure, I moved on to the next little step, and that was getting something secured at the bottom. So the way that I planned on putting this door in, I was racking my brain on it for a while of how I was going to have this hinged, and I thought that the best way of doing that would be to have a hole at the top and the bottom of the door frame that I could stick the door into. Kind of hard to explain, but you'll see as the video goes along how I did this. So what that required was me fixing a bottom board in the door frame, because it wasn't actually going to be secured to the side, it was going to be secured to the top and the bottom. At this point, I also thought again that the best way of securing this piece of wood in was going to be with 2 grooved out sections at the base, and then I could just fit it nicely in there, and that actually worked out really well for this purpose. This is probably my favorite part of this whole process, just because it ended up being so secure and it went just perfectly right. No issues, nothing went wrong, and it'll probably last fairly well. So now that the door frame, the jambs, and all of that is done, secured, and in place, I start working on the pieces of the door itself. Now, at this point, I was having to roughly split down some pieces of ash and then carve it, and I spent a lot of time just carving down this piece of ash with my axe. This was actually from a different ash tree, and this one was really solid, and it was not wanting to split, and it wasn't wanting to be cut down either, which is good for a door, but at this point I was really wishing I had a bandsaw out there. It took hours. After I had it carved down to roughly the size that I was wanting, I marked out roughly where I wanted it to be. So this was going to be the inside piece of my door, and I'm marking out where I'm going to drill holes, because what I'm going to do is I'm carving down the end of this piece of the door, and I'm actually planning on fitting it into these holes, and that's how I'm planning on getting this hinge. So marked it out and then drill the hole. After the hole was drilled, I roughly eyeballed what I was going to need to take out of the end to get it to fit into the hole, and then I just carved it down with the saw and chisel, and it came out really nicely. So I cut out more pieces of the door, and I decided the best way to fix together this rough door frame was going to be with half-lap joinery and dowels. So you can see me marking that out here, and I was just marking it out with the saw, and then I was cutting out the space, chiseling it out, and fitting it all together. and that took a little while to do, but it ended up turning out quite nicely. I was pretty happy at this point. I was finally getting to see the work come together a little bit. The door was actually starting to look a little bit door-like, and you can see here that the hinge mechanism that I had planned on, that I'll be honest, I really had my doubts as to whether or not it was going to work. It seemed too simple. It actually turned out quite nicely. The only issue I was facing at this point was that the door frame itself was kind of wobbly, and the door frame this whole way through did stay kind of wobbly. It's because when you're working in the woods, it's hard to get things perfectly square, and if things aren't perfectly square, they don't generally stay as strong as you might like or hope that they would be. That said, I was able to fix the shakiness to some degree of this door with a cross member. And for any of you who are really aware of cross members, particularly in doors and that type of woodworking, yes, I did put this from the wrong corner to the wrong corner, but it works and it did the job that I needed it to, so I'm happy. That was the end of day 1, and then this is the beginning of day 2 for me. I'm out in the woods, scrounging around in the dirt, but this is how I was shown to look for spruce roots, and I was going to need a good portion of spruce roots today for this job. So I was thinking about how I was going to actually fill that space in the door frame, and I decided that birch bark was probably going to be the best way to go. It's light, it covers the space, it's fairly strong, and I didn't want to spend the time splitting down more pieces of ash to fit into that space. Also, ash would be pretty heavy, or any type of wood that I'd be using in there would be pretty heavy, whereas the birch bark would be pretty light. Now, I was going to need some way of securing the birch bark to the door, so I decided spruce root, or I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if I found any spruce root out there. I think I used mostly fir root and cedar root to do this, which works all right as well, but it's not the best. I was going to need a good portion of that to tie this birch bark to the door frame. The way I would usually go about collecting spruce root or any kind of tree roots, and the way that I was taught, is you drag a stick through the dirt until you start catching on roots, and once you catch a piece of root, you just follow through with that piece of root and dig up as much of it as you can, and sometimes you can get up to 10, 15, 20 feet of root in just a single piece. Definitely a good skill to have. So I forgot more tools that I should have brought out again. At this point, I'm skinning the spruce root to get it down to the nice portion of the root, which is the usable bit. So I was having to take off the outer bark. Now, usually you would use a knife blade for this work. Unfortunately, I forgot a knife at home, so I was having to use the back of my axe. After I had the spruce root skinned, the next part of the job was splitting for me. So with spruce root or cedar root or any type of root that you can use for sewing, you can usually split it down at least in half. Sometimes you can split it down into ribbons, as many as 4 pieces. So for the smaller pieces that I'm using, I only split them in half if I could, and that gets you a lot more spruce root that way. So now was on to the big job of the day, and that was getting a sheet of birch bark that would be big enough and strong enough to cover my door. So I found a birch tree that looked good, and I started to cut down it. So the proper way to harvest birch bark involves cutting a line straight down the tree, and then in the perfect world, it'll just split off nice. You'll have a fine, clean sheet of birch bark. Now, unfortunately, again, keeping in tune with how the rest of this project has been going, that's not what happened in this case. What ended up happening was the birch bark started to pull off some of the inner layer of wood. It didn't want to split off really that easily at all. I suspect that part of the reason the birch bark didn't want to come off is because I was a little bit early for the birch bark collecting season. I needed the birch bark though, so it was coming off one way or another. Now, it was at this point right here that things started getting a little bit carried away. I was just focused on getting the bark off, and so what I did was I girdled the tree. And that's when you cut all the way around the base of the tree. And I did this twice at the top and the bottom of the sheet of bark that I was trying to get off. So it did end up helping me get this sheet of bark off, but it probably killed the tree, which is unfortunate, but you can see I'm in the woods. There's plenty of trees around, and something will grow up to take its place. Still didn't feel great about it, though. So I flattened out the sheet of bark. I managed to get it nicely cleaned up, and at this point I'm getting it prepped and ready to be sewn onto my door. This is the last little hurdle of finishing up this door, and when this is done, that's done. I have a door, and I was pretty happy to be getting closer to the end on this. So I've got a little bucket there with some water in my spruce roots, or cedar roots as it may be in it, and keeping the roots wet helps to keep them pliable, so it's easier to sew with them. Ideally it's good to boil them up, but I didn't feel like making a fire that day, and this was enough anyways. They did work quite well for sewing up, and they did hold decently well. Spruce roots are kind of a weird material to sew with. They're quite rigid, but at the same time they're also quite flexible. So sewing with them is really quite different. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually just tucking a piece of spruce root between the door frame and the birch bark and just wrapping it around. And because of the rigidity of the root, that's enough to hold it in place. Then I'm running it through a small hole I made with an awl. And that's another really important tool to have whenever you're doing work with sewing birch bark. An awl is something that is indispensable, very useful. So what I'm doing is I'm just wrapping this piece of root around a few times, and I'll put a few more holes in, and then once that wrap's all done, that'll hold very strong and securely. Now, it's also worth mentioning too that when spruce root dries out, it maintains the rigidity, but it actually becomes quite brittle at that point. So it will hold kind of like you've tied something with wood. It's a really interesting material to work with, but it is really good for this job. One last little piece of root to be tied on, and then with that being finished, the door is complete. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on good old-fashioned Canadian bushcraft.